You are very welcome to this Sunday blitz, a true blitz today. It's not going to be me raving on for half an hour. What should we think about Russian propaganda claiming that Zelensky is asking the UK for a dirty bomb? First of all, understand that Russian propaganda has to have something to talk about. They don't have much good stuff to talk about. So they're going to talk about nuclear threat and World War III, naturally. The second bit to understand is that, we've said this a million times, it's the default diplomatic tool of the Russian Federation to threaten nuclear war, try to change our perceptions about nuclear war risk in the West. The third aim here is to prep the Russian population for a potential nuclear use, but that's always going on in a low-key way, and it doesn't imply anything urgent or concrete in my view. So am I very worried about that? No, not at all. Are oligarchs in danger in Russia? Well, they're not in danger sort of next month. They're under pressure, and one of the pressures they feel is that there's a kind of expectation that they should fund the war and contribute to the war, which then, of course, leads you to the conclusion that there aren't oligarchs in Russia, as we keep repeating, because being an oligarch implies a degree of independent power. Having a lot of money in Russia doesn't give you independent power. So they are under pressure, and they could suffer, if not collectively, then in a sort of pointillistic way, some really, really unlovely fates in the months to come. They could get picked on, and they feel there isn't much they can do, and they also feel that there isn't even much they can say, possibly even in private, that you'd be in trouble even if you started speaking in private critically about the regime, because that'll be picked up if you've got enough money. Are the mobilized Russians feeling rebellious? No, they're not. They're feeling rebellious about bad conditions, but they're not feeling politically rebellious. And one of the thoughts you've got to keep in mind is this sort of pervasive idea that the regime has in a very successful way drilled into people to think that if something is very bad where you are, that might not be how things are everywhere else, and that you might be the exception. So there's kind of almost a kind of a magical power the regime's propaganda, because it's so accumulative over so many years, has. People just get stuck in thinking piecemeal about their problems and not generalizing them into a wide political perspectives. So no, the rebellion seemed to me to be contingent on, you're not giving us stuff we need, not on we disagree with this war and this is wrong. Is Putin a post-truth politician? Yes and no, interestingly. Yes, because Putin's regime is just paradigmatically a post-truth regime. So a post-truth regime isn't a regime that lies, it's a regime that systematically destabilizes the idea that anything about anything is ever true. So that's clearly a post-truth feature of Putin. But is he personally somebody who is, in a kind of psychological way, a post-truth politician? No, not very much. He is personally close to being either a systematic liar or somebody who just treats speech as political technology. I think that's a more accurate thing to say. But he's not like a politician who enjoys saying 4 different things about the same issue during the week, and in the process giving people the impression that there is nothing really definitively true about this issue and that you can't get to the bottom of it, and you might as well perhaps just give up on working it out. So that's the sort of thing his regime accomplishes, but he himself actually is not that clearly a post-truth politician in his psychological profile. Is your tweet about nuclear risk obvious? And I tweeted, a peace deal imposed on Ukraine today, hypothetically, does not obviously reduce nuclear risk. It postpones it and it could possibly make it greater. No action on our part can take nuclear risk away. And human beings struggle with this because human beings struggle with the idea that a problem might have no solution. Is it obvious that conceding to Putin's nuclear blackmail might not reduce but could actually increase nuclear risk? I think it's true, but it's not obvious. Because a lot of what I'm saying here is predicated on the fact that Putin and the Putin regime don't have a kind of particular delimited obsession with Ukraine. Putin's aim is to escalate as far as he is allowed to escalate on the international stage and see what happens, see if that shakes up the international system to some degree. So because after watching the Putin regime for a couple of decades, I'm overwhelmingly confident about that. That informs my view about nuclear risk. If you thought that Ukraine was in no way part of a broader pattern of escalation, then your evaluation of nuclear risk could appropriately change. Do you see what I'm saying? Unless you actually know what the Kremlin is doing, I do think the Elon Musk position can look pretty superficially compelling. What are we doing risking World War III in exchange for some provinces in one country? One of over 200 countries in the world. No country in the world is worth nuclear risk quadrupling. So I think that it's not obvious, and the main reason that it's not obvious is that it's tied to my views about not just the intentions of the Kremlin, but how the Kremlin inevitably cannot but operate. So that's my answer. True, but not obvious. If Putin died tomorrow and his regime got overthrown, how many people would really miss him? I hope to talk to you very well, but briefly, but very well about this on the main channel very, very soon. Very few. If you got rid of propaganda blaring on all TV stations and you didn't make criticism of the regime punishable by death or prison, we're talking about double figures, but less than 20% of the population. And, with a bit of time, you would see a situation where the number of people who love Putin, if Putin is gone and Putin's regime is gone, is lower than the number of people in Germany who liked Hitler a few years after the end of the Second World War. In other words, there isn't that kind of love of leader, real love of leader in Russia. Never has been. That's been a fabrication. That's been a sort of concoction. Putin has never been, in a genuine way, loved by the Russian people. Can you comment on Kirienko saying that Russia needs this war to become a people's war if it is to win it? Kirienko is the deputy chief of staff of the administration. I don't think it's possible for this to become a people's war. In other words, I don't believe that Russia could go fully totalitarian with the regime and the people coming together as one. It can progressively become more of a total war, though, and it wouldn't surprise me if Russia continued making further totalitarian steps and locking into this war more and more citizens, more and more of the Russian population, and that kind of speech is supposed to normalize and encourage this. Could you have martial law in Moscow? Well, in a limited way you already do, because now local authorities have increased powers, and that's true of Moscow too. But could you have a more dramatic kind of martial law where people can just come and take your stuff if it fits the war aims? For example, if you've got a nice jeep that could negotiate difficult terrain. Yeah, I could imagine that. I think it's still less likely than likely, but we're talking a coin toss pretty much. So it's possible in 2023. What to do with over 65s in Russia who seem to strongly support the war? So I like this question because it gives me the possibility to correct an impression I may have given. I constantly keep saying that if we're going to be cartoonish about the Russian population, we've got to say they know what's happening. They're not misinformed. They know. They're just in denial. They can't face it. And partly they can't face it because they don't know what to do about it, or they don't feel they can do anything about it. They don't feel they've got enough people on board with them, enough the population on board with them. But I don't think that sort of denial is as true of the older generation. I actually think that the older generation, folks who are 70, 80, are genuinely closer to the paradigm of just being awfully naive and misinformed and ignorant. I think there is less denial with the older generation. I think they're really victims of the TV box. When I had grandparents sort of born in the 20s, you could see that kind of thing, that kind of potential for extraordinary naivety about what's said on TV. They're not online. They're isolated. They have fantasies about the Second World War. They're closer to the paradigm of just being ignorant and spectacularly naive. Talk to you very soon. Lots of love.